I think, if you do research about pensions, you realize reforming pensions is a challenge. I think we can also say publishing an edited volume is also a challenge, and as my collaborators present today know very well, it took us quite some years to get from the first research papers that were written within this project to the final book publication. Nevertheless, I can also say that this long journey actually had some advantages, because we were able to really incorporate some new issues that came up during global pension debates, and we have seen actually some interesting changes happening with regard to pension policy reform debates. And one of the most obvious one is that whereas we had a strong emphasis on pensions as a growth instrument in the 1990s and early 2000s, now the poverty reduction function of pensions is very high on the agenda, and we have seen an interest in the rise of social pensions, for example. So these and some other findings from our project actually challenge an important part of the conventional pension wisdom, or what I will call later in my presentation the myths, making reference to a famous paper that was published by Orszag and Stieglitz in 1999. And before my collaborators Markus Löwe and Fred Hendricks actually will share with you some insights from concrete case studies presented in the book, I would like to set the scene and introduce you to some key facts and debates on pension reform, and present some findings and lessons from the case studies we have in the book. And in doing this, I actually want to highlight three very positive messages. And maybe I leave some of the more challenging messages to my colleagues later on. And the first good news is actually that after a period, as I said, where pensions have been seen mainly as a growth instrument, there seems to be nowadays a better understanding of the multiple roles of pensions, and actually ways to get to an appropriate balance between these different roles pension system has to play. The second good news is that the period of one-size-fits-all model seems to be over. And we actually see a diversity of approaches and of reform models. And the third good news is that whatever pension system you have, even if it is the legacy of a dictatorship as we have seen in Chile, you can actually improve pensions. And we have a lot of evidence on this as well. So when we start off with looking at some very basic facts about pension systems in different contexts, of course we see the diversity of models and of coverage and of spending on pension systems. And if we look, for example, at this graph on legal pension coverage by region, we see big differences with Western Europe, Central Eastern Europe, North America reaching legal coverage rates over 80%, followed by Latin America, followed by the Middle East and some Northern African countries. But in Asia and Pacific and Sub-Saharan Africa, actually quite low legal coverage rates. Next, please. And if we look at another indicator about pension coverage, old age pensioners as a share of the entire population above the legal retirement age, we can see a similar picture. As you can see on this map, actually the dark green places have very high coverage rates, over 90%. Interestingly, we also find this in Southern Africa. But then when we get to the lighter blues, we actually see effective coverage rates of under 20% in many places of the world. Next, please. In addition to this diversity in terms of existing pension systems, it is very important to acknowledge the economic and political importance of pension systems. And actually, when we look at the magnitude of pension funds, we can approach this both from a stock perspective, looking actually at pension assets accumulated in public or private pension funds, or we can look at it from a flow perspective and looking at actually the amount of social spending on pensions and the amount of contributions collected. Both reveal that pension funds are really one of the most important social programs in most countries. And here we see on the left side, the magnitude of pension funds accumulated in the more developed countries, but also when we look at the right-hand side, countries like South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, and many others have actually huge amounts of pension funds in percent to GDP accumulated. The next graph shows the same picture in terms of flow categories, and here you can see that public and private expenditure can be as high as 15% of GDP, mostly in the more advanced European countries such as France, Italy, or Austria. So, which way we see it, we can see that actually an important amount of the state budget, or if you look at it from a private perspective, an important amount of market shares actually have to do with pensions. And this has very direct implications for power, both for political power but also for financial power. And I think we will hear more about this in the other presentations. Across the globe now, these pension systems are faced with some common challenges, and we can also observe some common responses to these challenges. And I want to go over this very quickly. One of the common challenge, of course, is coverage and adequacy of benefits. Who is covered, formal workers, citizens? Shall the system be rather targeted to income maintenance or poverty reduction? Another challenge is to achieve both actuarial fairness and social fairness within the system, so contribution benefit links, but also protecting the more vulnerable groups or those that have less ability actually to contribute. Very big issue, the costs of the entire system and who actually pays for it. And finally, governance issues are also very important in many of the countries we have looked at. So I will go over this and go directly into actually how policymakers but also scholars have confronted these common challenges. And actually during a long time there was quite diverse views on what was the best pension model to follow, and we had a diversity of models in place. But in the 1990s what we can see is that there was an attempt actually to provide a universal reform blueprint to what was considered a global problem. So I call this the pension battle, the pension reform battle in a way, and I just put out for those who know a little bit about these policy debates, some of the key publications that were published in that time. And the most important reform proposal was actually made by the World Bank in 1994. And the model that the World Bank proposed was based on the Chilean pension reform that was implemented in the early 1980s, and where the Chilean government had substituted a public pay-as-you-go finance pension system with decentralized, privately administered and fully funded pension accounts. Now, this pension model, despite the early criticism, was then very successful in the coming years. And actually when we, next please, and actually when we, maybe one more, and I go back to this slide later, because we could actually see these pension reforms happening in more than 30 countries around the globe, and countries as different as Latin America and middle-income countries, but also in Africa and in transition countries. And now back to to this one. Before the Chilean model, most of the pension systems had been based on one of the traditional or ideal type models. And we have those systems that were more designed according to a Bismarckian type system with defined benefits, contribution financed, and basically aiming at status maintenance. We also had systems that were more strongly leaning towards beverage type models with the principal aim of poverty reduction, basically providing tax financed flat benefits. But we also had, especially in many developing countries, national provident funds, which are capitalized systems but publicly administered, and basically a savings scheme, and then starting in the 1980s, but basically spreading across to these 30 countries, we see the multipillar model that had its origin in Chile, and which is organized around individual and privately administered pension funds. Next, please. Now, what was the objective actually with this type of reform? Basically, the reform was promoted very much as an instrument to reach different objectives. One was actually to reduce fiscal costs of public pension schemes in the process of aging. Another objective was actually to use funded schemes in order to promote growth through the accumulation of savings and through channeling these savings into the economy. And it was seen as specifically valuable in the case of transition and developing countries in order to develop their capital markets and their financial sector. There was another interesting argument, which was more a political economy argument, and which basically said that the more developed welfare states had shown difficulties in reforming their public pension schemes. And that it would be, and this is what in this slide where I talk about the pension reform battle, that was the Leninist strategy in a way. So it would be a good idea actually to have a new system where, you know, the costs and the benefits were not as clear as when you cut down acquired rights in a public system, and that this would actually reduce political resistance. Now, actually, we have seen that the Chilean model and the multi-pillar model promoted by the World Bank was very successful. Next, please. But when we get to the case studies we have collected in this volume, in this project, we see actually quite a diverse range of reform options chosen. So many of these countries we have studies have actually privatized the pension scheme, but a couple of countries also have chosen different reform options. And the interesting question is, why was this the case, and how do they differ in terms of reform outcomes? And another very interesting case is that 3 of the countries we have studied actually switched from a public pay-as-you-go system to a private scheme, and very recently switched back to a public scheme. Now, I want to summarize my findings and organize that around 3 very persistent myths in pension reform debates, which the findings of our book, as I said in the beginning, actually challenge. Before I come to the first myth, I would like to emphasize again that pension systems have multiple roles. And we all know about the social protection role of pension systems, and the economic development role, especially the growth role, has been emphasized very much in the 1990s. But in addition to that, actually pensions are also very important in terms of distributing funds and risks between groups and generations. And they also have a very important role to play for gender equity and social reproduction. Next, please. Now, what is quite a persistent myth, and was so until at least the early half of the 2000s, was that only the private model actually has a strong positive developmental role. Nevertheless, when we look at the evidence of the case studies we have in this project, we can clearly say, and this of course complements a lot of research that has been done in many places, that the private model actually has not kept promises for many reasons. So the rates of return were not as high as expected, the fiscal costs were very high, private sector funding was reduced because the private pension funds actually had to invest in public debt to cover the transition costs created by the reform, etc. What is very important, that maybe was not so high up in the debates, is that the private model has been really less successful in terms of the other roles I have just described, especially redistribution, protection, also gender equity and social cohesion. And some of actually the costs of public systems that have been so much criticized by the proponents of the private model are actually related to political functions of pension systems, where we rarely talk about, and this will also be an issue in the following presentation. A second myth is a universal reform blueprint exists, and obviously the evidence is that there is no one model. And we had policy diffusion and policy learning processes taking place in the 1990s, but we have a redefinition of these processes over the last decade. And actually now it is clear that there is a diversity of models, and even the international pension advice has actually been a lot more diversified now. If we look at the country cases, we see that actually the reform models are driven by a combination of international and national factors. Next. And the global policy blueprint is just one of these international drivers, and it was very much related to the international crisis and balance of payments crisis, etc. But we have seen changes more recently. We have seen the Great Recession in 2008, and we have seen a rise in the global poverty agenda. When we look at it nationally, of course, there is a range of reform drivers that lead to very different outcomes. Next, please. Finally, the third myth: pension models are carved in stone. Why do I say this? Because basically in the 1980s and 1990s, as I said, there was a great pessimism about the possibility to reform public pension schemes. And it was basically deemed impossible to reform a public pension scheme because, aging societies, the power of the median voter, it's not possible, it's unpopular. But once the systems had actually been privatized, the same argument was made. And it was said, now we have this new institutional setup, costs have been high, it's basically not possible now to improve these systems anymore. And actually, as you can see from the case studies in the book, the good news is that whether you have a public system or you have a private scheme, there are reforms that can actually improve both the economic and the social outcomes of these reforms. And we have, for example, in terms of equity, Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile, for example, have improved redistribution, equity, and coverage in the systems. Brazil and South Korea, for example, have reformed their civil servants' pension schemes and reduced costs and made up fiscal space also for more redistribution. Next, please. So I'm a little bit over time. I apologize. I want to just finalize my presentation by drawing out some lessons emerging from this. And the first lesson is that pension systems have an important developmental role. And this developmental role doesn't depend primarily on whether it is private or public or funded or pay-go. What is important actually is to recognize and balance the multiple functions of pension systems, and to see that we cannot sacrifice the social protection function by trying to promote growth, but nevertheless a system that is not fiscally sustainable and is not actually promoting the economy is also not sustainable in the long run. A second important implication is that the role of the state and pension system has to be strengthened. And this is a clear finding that emerges from the different case studies where we actually see that the successful reforms in Latin America, for example, of the private systems actually involve a stronger role of the state in order to improve equity in these systems. And finally, of course, reform models, wherever they come from, they need to be adjusted to country context. We also have seen that successful pension reform shared a set of characteristics. For example, they created and seized windows of opportunity for reform. They created political consensus. And for those reforms that have actually increased equity, they have mobilized fiscal space. And finally, if we want to maximize the economic and social impact of pension systems, it is important to see them also as one element, one part of universal and comprehensive social protection schemes. It is important to have the right balance between social insurance and more redistributive social pensions. It is important to adjust or to create new institutions and to actually coordinate the different components of social protection systems, including, for example, very important for the elderly, social services, healthcare and long-term care. Another issue, increasing gender equity and fairness and social justice in pension schemes, actually means that there is need for an important amount of redistribution within the system. And finally, those reforms that have been more successful and that are actually credible also in the longer term, they have strengthened the rights basis of the pension schemes and have grounded them in international conventions, in ILO recommendations or conventions, social security principles, and human rights instruments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katja. Fred, would you like to follow with the South African case study?
Yeah, okay, thank you. I started becoming interested in pensions through a very fortuitous encounter. I was approached by one of the previous directors of UNRISD, Thandika Mkandawire, to do something on pensions as part of their project on financing development. And my response was, but I know nothing about pensions. And in his kind of reckless, cavalier fashion, he reckoned to me, you learn soon enough. And so I took it upon myself to try to embark on an entirely different area of study to what I normally am acquainted with, and that was pensions. And I must say I'm very grateful to Thandika for having introduced me to this particular area, because through this particular study and besides being grateful to Thandika, I must also say that I'm very grateful to Katja for her persistence, and also to Harold for his pernickety editing. And, that it was a long haul, as you said, but eventually the publication came out, and I think that it's a fine publication. But in doing research around pensions, it became clear to me that what was happening in South Africa was one of the possibly second or even third of the biggest scandals in a democratic South Africa. And there have been a number of these scandals. Principally, I think, the major scandal of a democratic South Africa is the Marikana Massacre, which was a massacre of striking unarmed workers. 34 of them were mowed down by the security establishment of the democratic government. And for me, that remains the lowest point of democratic South Africa. But there have been a whole range of other low points. And what has happened with pensions, I think, is also one of the low points. The other things like the Nkandla debacle, I suppose the arms scandal, there are a whole range of them. But let me focus on what I'm interested in, why I say that it is a scandal. And there is a little bit of a narrative behind this, and so if you just bear with me for a few minutes. Basically what happened in South Africa was round about the time that the demise of apartheid was on the horizon, a decision was taken by the apartheid ideologues and top apparatchiks of the apartheid regime that they should change the pension system from one that functioned effectively as a pay-as-you-go system to a fully funded system. And this had enormous implications. As you may know, the pay-as-you-go system operates on the assumption that the current workers make their contributions, and those contributions go towards the benefits of the retired workers as pensions. There's a circularity, and by and large, no surplus is meant to be accumulated. The fully funded system works on an entirely different assumption, and the assumption there is that there must be enough money in the pension fund to pay each and every worker in the event of the concern going bankrupt. Now, to apply that assumption to a state is, in the first instance, spurious, because even if a state is bankrupt, it's not going to go anywhere. To cut a long story short, there are many reasons, and we can, I suppose, try to analyze what the motivations were behind this move to shift the pension fund. But one of the critical motivations had to be the anticipation of a much more redistributive ANC government, a much more redistributive democratic government than actually emerged. But having done this, having made this transition to a fully funded system, for the pensions of the public sector workers, and I must make this very clear that in South Africa there are both private and public pension systems. The public system works on the basis of a means test, and I think by and large it operates well. It is a massive transfer of resources from the state to the poor, and it is the difference between absolute destitution and mere survival, and so that pension I think works very well. The pension that interests me is the pension of the public sector workers, pensions of workers in the state sector. By shifting to a fully funded system, obviously the pension fund didn't have the money to fund this new pension system, and so what they did was to indebt themselves, knowing full well that they are actually indebting the incoming democratic government. Now, unlike other third world or southern countries whose debt is mostly foreign, 90% of South Africa's debt is domestic debt, and the overwhelming proportion of that debt is to the pension fund. It works in a very strange way, because the pension fund, of course, because we had as with everything in apartheid, we had a variety of different pension funds for a variety of different state sectors, and all of those, or most of those, were merged into something called the Government Employees Pension Fund after 1994, which was part of the process of, I suppose, realizing one of the major clauses of our Constitution, and that is to provide proper benefits in retirement. And also to ensure that there is some level of standardization to get rid of the racialized discrimination that apartheid had introduced and had sustained for a very long period. But by indebting the state in the way in which it did, it set up something called the Public Investment Corporation. Now, this is an outflow of my chapter on pensions, is on the Public Investment Corporation. The Public Investment Corporation is the main asset manager of the Government Employees Pension Fund. It has, in a kind of similar way to what has happened in Anglo-American countries, in England and the USA, which have resulted in pension funds developing an enormous fount of capital to become the main source of saving in those countries. In South Africa, the Public Investment Corporation becomes this huge body in our economy. It is the hugest investor in the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. It is a juggernaut in our economy, and yet it remains entirely unstudied, not only understudied, unstudied. It starts off, it's got quite a long history. It starts off in 1911 as what was then called the Public Debt Commissioners. It was, in other words, it was one of the first pieces of legislation, first institutions set up by the Union government. Union government starts in 1910. And it was there to take care of, its main mandate was to take care of the investment of state funds. That role evolved or mutated, or however you want to call it, into its becoming its major role now, having been corporatized in 2004, is now to manage the money of the Government Employees Pension Fund. The Government Employees Pension Fund, after Malaysia, is the biggest pension fund in the Southern Hemisphere. It's managed to accumulate, under the PIC, managed to accumulate a stockpile of 1.6 trillion rand. It is a huge amount of money that it has at its disposal. But because of the way in which the pension fund has been structured, because of this transition to a fully funded scheme, what it has imposed is a huge kind of, I suppose, like a sword of Damocles over the state, over the new state, because it is the second largest call on our budget to repay the debt incurred by ensuring that this pension fund remains a fully funded pension fund. So you can, there's a beautiful quote by Nelson Mandela himself, and I'd just like to use it because it kind of sets the tone for why this is such a scandalous continuation of a program, because it would have been relatively easy for the democratic government to revert back to something along the lines of a pay-as-you-go scheme, which would have allowed South Africa to be one of the countries with the least amount, the proportion of debt to GDP. At the moment it is quite high, precisely because of the repayments that they need to make to the pension fund. We are limited, says Nelson Mandela, in South Africa because our democratic government inherited a debt which at the time we are servicing at a rate of 30 billion rands a year. That is 30 billion rand we did not have to build houses, to make sure our children go to the best schools, and to ensure that everybody has the dignity of having a job and a decent income. And this is Nelson Mandela, the first president of democratic South Africa, making it very clear that one of the reasons that social spending is problematic is because of the levels of debt payments, and because of the approach to economic development more broadly that the government took. They ensured, or they attempted to ensure, that their levels of debt would be kept at a low level. Trevor Manuel, the first finance minister, says the bulk of our debt is in the domestic debt of ordinary South Africans through the public pension funds. So this is the problem that we have. We've got a problem in respect of the public sector contributory pension funds, which is it's a defined benefit scheme. It is a scheme which, as a result, and this is one of the pluses, I suppose, and there always are pluses, as a result of some savvy investments, they've managed to create a huge stockpile of capital, which has meant that they are in a position to pay reasonable pensioner increases on an annual basis to these workers in the public sector. But the biggest problem, of course, is what is the appropriate kind of approach given the economic problems that the country faces. South Africa at the moment has the dubious distinction of being either the first or the second most unequal country in the world. We vie with Brazil and Namibia for that dubious distinction. The overwhelming problem of the democratic South Africa remains the problem of black poverty. And as long as that remains the problem, the kind of approach that needs to be adopted needs, of course, to take that into account in a much more serious way, and it has not done that. In fact, the measures of inequality have increased since 1994, and all measures of inequality, both within particular communities as well as between different communities, the measures of inequality, principally the Gini coefficient, has gotten worse since 1994. So there are a few people that have benefited enormously from the democratic dispensation as a result of black economic empowerment, but the overwhelming problem of black poverty remains the enduring problem of the democratic state, and the main issue that we need to deal with in order to legitimize democracy, because insofar as the overwhelming majority of the population don't sense any difference in their material levels of living as a result of democracy, as long as there's no difference to them as to whether they were living under apartheid or living, economically speaking, South Africa is a much better place to live in now, of course, but economically speaking, if there is no substantial difference in their material levels of living, then it calls into question the legitimacy of the state. And that is in particular because the problem of poverty remains an overwhelmingly black problem. And because of this social stratification which remains still entirely racialized, the kind of approach, the kind of developmental approach that needs to be adopted in the country is not one which continues along the line of not only safeguarding and ensuring what has preceded during the apartheid regime, but in fact enhancing the trend towards privatization by corporatizing the Public Investment Corporation, so that it now is an entity that exists according to its founding piece of legislation, an entity that exists outside of the public service. So here you have a very strange animal. You have an entity existing outside of the public sector, privately managed, but state-owned, because the main representative, the main shareholder representative of the Public Investment Corporation is the Minister of Finance. And they manage the pensions of ordinary pensions in South Africa. So it's a very strange conglomeration of an entity being privately managed, state-owned, but managing the assets that actually belong in the final analysis to the pensioners themselves. So there are a whole range of questions that can be asked about this. Already mention has been made about the role of the state in development. Now, I think theoretically speaking, we can argue very forcefully along the lines of a greater role for the state in development. But I think we also have to take into account what kinds of capacity exist in a state being actually able to carry out a developmental role as proposed. And it's quite important that the policies, the broad-based policies, which try to insist on a greater role for the state, should take into account what is actually happening within the state in order to facilitate such an intervention. And at the moment, the levels of capacity within the state in South Africa are woeful and not in a position to carry out the kind of role, developmental role that we would expect of them. And so you can ask the question as to whether you require a public investment corporation, because the Public Investment Corporation, acting as this asset manager for the GEPF, whereas there are a whole range of other asset managers existing within the state. Now, if the Public Investment Corporation had a fundamentally developmental agenda, then of course you could argue in its favor, so that the investments coming from the Public Investment Corporation should be developmentally orientated, principally maybe into infrastructure. But that is not the agenda of this privately managed entity, and that's the research that I'm currently doing. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Fred.
My input is going to be on pension schemes and pension reforms in the Middle East and North Africa. And what I'm going to argue is that the existing pension schemes face multiple challenges with regards to social fairness, efficiency and sustainability. Only few tangible reforms have been implemented so far. Some parametric reforms, one major systemic change, but many plans to replace the existing pay-as-you-go schemes by funded schemes have not been implemented so far. And my conclusion is that MENA policymakers are reluctant to implement reforms that are aimed at improving the equity or sustainability or efficiency of the pension schemes, and this is very much for political reasons, which I will show later. Now, first of all, what are the challenges for the existing schemes? What I try to show is that financial issues are not the main challenge. On average, at least, governments in MENA spend much more on social protection and health than comparable other countries. So these data are from the mid-2000s, but they are still in the same range. So the main challenges are how the available sufficient funds are used, because this way leads to deficits in terms of fairness and efficiency. Now, the first challenge is, of course, like in many other parts of the world, gaps in coverage. Here, the big dots are MENA countries, the smaller ones are other countries in the world, and you do see some countries on the top in the MENA region. These are mainly North African countries, which have tried to extend the coverage of their schemes to additional groups of the population, which one would normally call the informal sector. But the bulk of countries, even the richer ones that you see on the right of this plot, cover only a relatively small part of the population. The second gap is the fragmentation of schemes. Now, this pyramid symbolizes a typical society. The rich on the top, the poor on the bottom, and the line in between symbolizes, in a way, the border between the formal and the informal sector. And here you see that different groups are covered by different social protection schemes. The very rich, the green ones on the top, they have a private life insurance. Then you have the non-contributory pension schemes paid by taxes for the armed forces and higher rank state employees. This is for Egypt some 8% of the population. That's the red share. Then you have social insurance pension, a regular normal pay-as-you-go scheme for the rest of the formal sector. That's the orange field, which is in Egypt de facto covering some 36% of the population. Then you have a scheme which has been designed for self-employees, covering some 5% of the population. That's the lighter orange field in the top of the informal sector. And then you have at the very bottom some 5% of the population covered by social assistance, another 5% by a subsidized basic social insurance pension, but a large part of the population in between, that's the white field, which is not covered by any social protection, by any pension scheme at all. So you see, in addition to this fragmentation, you still have a coverage, a gap in coverage in in pensions and in social protection in general. The third challenge is regressive redistribution. Now, this graph is based on figures which are rather old, but I haven't found better data for which are more up to date. This is for Jordan from the early 2000s. Now, Jordan has changed its system, so the picture for Jordan in particular will look quite differently, but the picture looks quite similar for the rest of many MENA countries. And in a nutshell, these bars show to what degree the existing pension and health systems in the region receive net transfers from the government budget. We have to keep in mind for this that the government budget is fed mainly by indirect taxes, which are borne not only by the better off, but also by the poor. And you see those groups of the population, the armed forces and civil servants, that are already better off, they receive huge net transfers, while the very poor receive much smaller ones. Yeah, just one little item that I should highlight, that's the red bar in the middle. This red bar in the middle is due to the fact that there is a minimum pension rule in the pension scheme for the normal, for the formal sector. Now, you would say a minimum pension rule is something good. But in a scheme that covers mainly people from the middle classes, it's a net transfer from the entire population to those who are already not the very poorest of society. So this chart shows very well that redistribution in such schemes is bottom-up rather than top-down. Taxpayers finance schemes that are mainly protecting the better off in the middle sector and those who are really among the better off in society. The fourth challenge in these schemes is deficits and sustainability, which are due to several issues. Now, first you have relatively high administration costs. Then you have generous pension formulas. Then you have incentives for the manipulation of the declared wages. Since pensions are based just on the income during the last 3 years, employers and employees both have an interest of over-declaring wages during these 3 last years, while under-declaring them before. Then you have very generous minimum pension rules, as I've mentioned already. Then you have generous early retirement options. For example, previously in the Jordanian scheme, you could retire at age 32. And at age 35 in the general schemes of both Jordan and Bahrain. And finally, the reserves are invested in very inefficient ways. I shouldn't go too much into the details here, because I think the things that are the effects the effects of these rules are quite well known. We should rather look at what has happened in terms of pension reforms. Now, a number of countries have introduced parametric reforms, certainly improving a bit the existing schemes. So an independent investment unit has been established in some countries, improving the investment of reserves. The minimum age of retirement has been raised in 2 countries. Pension levels have been capped in Egypt. Minimum pensions have been reduced in Jordan. And pension increases are now indexed to changes in average wages in 3 countries. So these are parametric reforms. But what about systemic reforms? Now, all pension schemes in Jordan have been merged in 2003 into one. Now, this is really a big step forward, because it reduces this negative redistribution within the schemes, and it creates the same rules for everybody in Jordan. But it's the only country that has done this big step forward. Then efforts have been made to raise the effective coverage rate of pension schemes in at least 6 countries in the region, and I should go a bit into detail for Tunisia in this aspect. But for the rest, all plans to replace the existing pay-as-you-go schemes by a funded scheme or in other ways have never been implemented. In Egypt, the law has already been passed by parliament, but after what some people call the Arab Spring in 2011, the law has been put on ice and is there since then. So what has happened in Tunisia, which has been quite successful in raising the coverage rate? The country nowadays has 12 schemes administered by 2 different bodies for different groups of the population. I don't go through all these groups, just perhaps to mention that there is a scheme for people in agriculture and one for low-income earners such as domestic workers and independent fishermen and so on. So a different scheme for different parts of the population. Tunisia has been able to achieve a coverage of more than 80% of the working population in 2010. That was prior to the Arab Spring. Now the coverage rate has gone down a bit. What has been the factors of success? Now, first, there was a strong commitment of policymakers to implement these reforms, and a high accountability of bureaucrats vis-à-vis policymakers, which should not be taken for granted in a country such as Tunisia. Then, the government has run awareness campaigns in television and on the streets to get people into the schemes. Then there has been intensive monitoring of enrollment and contribution payment in the country. There have been possibilities to sanction non-declaration of income or employment. There have been financial incentives. Some of the schemes are heavily subsidized by the government budget. Then we have different benefit packages for different groups of the population. And then these schemes are very well tailored to the needs of the population. To give you just one example, in the beginning, the scheme for the agricultural workers didn't include family allowances, mainly child benefits. Because the government argued that this was not a really necessary component of the scheme. This was the most popular scheme attached to the pension scheme in the country. So people in the informal sector didn't like the scheme. They even call the whole pension scheme Dar al-Awlad, which means the house of the children, showing how popular this component was. So in the second step, they added this component to the pension scheme, and after that, they attracted quite a huge number of people in the agricultural sector. So that shows that really schemes have to be well tailored to a specific group, and you need a lot of information what people really want from the systems. And finally, you have a good customer service. Now, I would say, if based on the assumption that you continue having a contributory scheme, this way of Tunisia is a really a good example for other countries as well. The alternative would, of course, be to move towards a more non-contributory schemes that have the same conditions for everybody, because you have larger opportunities for redistribution in such schemes. Now, to conclude, funding is not the main problem in these countries. Rather, available funds are spent for inefficient instruments and allocated in an equitable way that leads to regressive redistribution. Likewise, lack of technical and administrative know-how does not constitute the decisive bottleneck. If needed, MENA governments could buy it on the market and did so quite frequently in the past. Apparently, political factors are a major problem. And what we can see is that most MENA governments have to perform in social policies. Many countries are based on revolutions or wars of independence. So they had to perform in social policies in order to legitimize their rule. So there was something like a social contract between them and citizens. So citizens accepted there was no political participation. But governments, on the other hand, provided relatively generous social benefits to the population in the past. But with changes, the reduction of receipts from oil and gas, and with the growing populations, this old social contract didn't work anymore. The provision of social benefits had become too expensive for governments. So the governments increasingly started focusing their social benefits more and more on the most influential groups, which are the army, the public employees, and parts of the well-educated urban middle classes. Ultimately, they did not dare to implement reforms with negative effects on these groups. Rather, they accept disadvantages that doing nothing may have for the poor or the population as a whole. So the only states that have really tried to integrate the informal sector in pension schemes either had redundant resources. They could still look even for those outside the the educated urban middle classes. That was countries such as Algeria, Libya, Kuwait, or they had a regime that was where the power was based much more on oppression than on this old social contract. So my argument would be that MENA countries would need a new social contract that really redefines that arrangement between governments and citizens in the future. Thank you.